Welcome. I am Kevin Delaney, and I want to welcome you to this installment of Read with Kev. Today, we have a very interesting book by Orison Swett Marden. This is called Pushing to the Front, and it was published in 1911. It's a collection of essays by Orison Swett Marden. I'll show you a picture of him that's here in this book, on a number of topics related to basically success in life. That's Orison Swett Marden. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe he had a publication. I'm not sure what it was called, but a lot of these essays and articles were written for his magazine and were subsequently collected into a number of books. So this is one of them. And there's an essay in particular here that I just absolutely love. It's called The Country Boy. And I want to read it to you. Again, this was published now in this book in 1911. If it was published initially in one of his magazines, it may have been from a couple of years prior to that, or a few years prior. But it was collected in this book and published in 1911. Keep that in mind as we go through this essay. This is chapter 4 of Pushing to the Front by Orison Swett Marden, and it's titled The Country Boy. I'll interject little thoughts every now and then. The Napoleonic Wars so drained the flower of French manhood that even today the physical stature of the average Frenchman is nearly half an inch below what it was at the beginning of Napoleon's reign. The country in America today is constantly paying a similar tribute to the city in the sacrifice of its best blood, its best brain, the finest physical and mental fiber in the world. The great stream of superb country manhood, which is ever flowing cityward, is rapidly deteriorated by the softening, emasculating influences of the city, until the superior virility, stamina, and sturdy qualities entirely disappear in 2 or 3 generations of city life. Our city civilization is always in a process of decay, and would in a few generations become emasculated and effeminate were it not for the pure crystal stream of country youth flowing steadily into and purifying the muddy, devitalized stream of city life. It would soon become so foul and degenerate as to threaten the physical and moral health of city dwellers. As you can tell, he's very much on the side of life in the country as opposed to life in the city. And I should just add, too, his writing style is very kind of rambling. There really isn't a lot of structure to his writing. You kind of get the impression that he just started on the first sentence and he just wrote whatever was on his mind, and then at some point he just ended it. And you'll notice he's rather repetitive. And of course, again, this being 1911, there was a certain style of writing that was very much common at that time that is different from anything we're used to in a modern type of book. One of our great men says that one of the most unfortunate phases of modern civilization is the drift away from the farm, the drift of country youth to the city, which has an indescribable fascination for him. His vivid imagination clothes it with Arabian Nights possibilities and joys. The country seems tame and commonplace after his first dream of the city. To him, it is synonymous with opportunity, with power, with pleasure. He cannot rid himself of its fascination until he tastes its emptiness. He cannot know the worth of the country and how to appreciate the glory of its disadvantages and opportunities until he has seen the sham and shallowness of the city. Keep in mind, 1911. One of the greatest boons that can ever come to a human being is to be born on a farm and reared in the country. Self-reliance and grit are oftenest country bred. The country boy is constantly thrown upon his own resources, forced to think for himself, and this calls out his ingenuity and inventiveness. He develops better all-round judgment and a more level head than the city boy. His muscles are harder, his flesh firmer, and his brain fiber partakes of the same superior quality. The very granite hills, the mountains, the valleys, the brooks, the miracle of the growing crops are every moment registering their mighty potencies in his constitution, putting iron into his blood and stamina into his character, all of which will help to make him a giant when he comes to compete with the city-bred youth. The sturdy, vigorous, hardy qualities, the stamina, the brawn, the grit which characterize men who do great things in this world are, as a rule, country bred. If power is not absorbed from the soil, it certainly comes from very near it. There seems to be a close connection between robust character and the soil, the hills, mountains, and valleys, the pure air and sunshine. There is a very appreciable difference between the physical stamina, the brain vigor, the solidity and the reliability of country-bred men and that of those in the city. The average country-bred youth has a better foundation for success building, has greater courage, more moral stamina. He has not become weakened and softened by the superficial, ornamental, decorative influences of city life. And there is a reason for all of this. We are largely copies of our environment. We are under the perpetual influence of the suggestion of our surroundings. The city-bred youth sees and hears almost nothing that is natural, aside from the faces and forms of human beings. Nearly everything that confronts him from morning till night is artificial, man-made. He sees hardly anything that God made, that imparts solidity, strength, and power, as do the natural objects in the country. How can a man build up a solid, substantial character when his eyes and ears bring him only sights and sounds of artificial things? A vast sea of business blocks, skyscrapers, and asphalt pavements do not generate character-building material. Just as sculpture was once carried to such an extreme that pillars and beams were often so weakened by the extravagant carvings as to threaten the safety of the structure, so the timber in country boys and girls, when brought to the city, is often overcarved and adorned at the cost of strength, robustness, and vigor. In other words, virility, forcefulness, physical and mental stamina reach their maximum in those who live close to the soil. The moment a man becomes artificial in his living, takes on artificial conditions, he begins to deteriorate, to soften. Much of what we call the best society in our cities is often in an advanced process of decay. Now, let me just add here, he doesn't seem to have anything positive to say about life in the city. So be prepared for pretty much 100% criticism of city life here. The muscles may be a little more delicate, but they are softer. The skin may be fairer, but it is not so healthy. The thought a little more supple, but less vigorous. The whole tendency of life in big cities is toward deterioration. City people rarely live really normal lives. It is not natural for human beings to live far from the soil. It is Mother Earth and country life that give vitality, stamina, courage, and all the qualities which make for manhood and womanhood. What we get from the country is solid, substantial, enduring, reliable. What comes from the artificial conditions of the city is weakening, enervating, softening. The country youth, on the other hand, is in the midst of a perpetual miracle. He cannot open his eyes without seeing a more magnificent painting than a Raphael or a Michelangelo could have created in a lifetime. And this magnificent panorama is changing every instant. There is a miracle going on in every growing blade of grass and flower. Is it not wonderful to watch the chemical processes in nature's laboratory, mixing and flinging out to the world the gorgeous colorings and marvelous perfumes of the rose and wild flower? No city youth was ever in such a marvelous kindergarten, where perpetual creation is going on in such a vast multitude of forms. The city youth has, too, many things to divert his attention. Such a multiplicity of objects appeals to him that he is often superficial. He lacks depth. His mind is perpetually drawn away from his subject, and he lacks continuity of thought and application. This was obviously well before the smartphone era. His reading is comparatively superficial. He glances through many papers, magazines, and periodicals and gives no real thought to any. His evenings are much more broken up than those of the country boy, who, having very little diversion after supper, can read continuously for an entire evening on one subject. The country boy does not read as many books as the city boy, but as a rule, he reads them with much better results. The dearth of great libraries, books, and periodicals is one reason why the country boy makes the most of good books and articles, often reading them over and over again, while the city youth, in the midst of newspapers and libraries, sees so many books that in most instances he cares very little for them, and will often read the best literature without absorbing any of it. The fact is, there is such a diversity of attractions and distractions, of temptation and amusement in the city, that unless a youth is made of unusual stuff, he will yield to the persuasion of the moment and follow the line of least resistance. It is hard for the city-bred youth to resist the multiplicity of allurements and pleasures that bid for his attention, to deny himself and turn a deaf ear to the appeals of his associates, and tie himself down to self-improvement while those around him are having a good time. These exciting, diverting, tempting conditions of city life are not conducive to generating the great master purpose, the one unwavering life aim, which we often see so marked in the young man from the country. Nor do city-bred youths store up anything like the reserve power, the cumulative force, the stamina, which are developed in the simple life of the soil. For one thing, the country boy is constantly developing his muscular system. His health is better. He gets more exercise, more time to think and to reflect. Hence, he is not so superficial as the city boy. His perceptions are not so quick. He is not so rapid in his movements. His thought action is slower, and he does not have as much polish, it is true, but he is better balanced generally. He has been forced to do a great variety of work, and this has developed corresponding mental qualities. The drudgery of the farm, the chores which we hated as boys, the rocks which we despised, we have found were the very things which educated us, which developed our power and made us practical. The farm is a great gymnasium, a superb manual training school, nature's kindergarten, constantly calling upon the youth's self-reliance and inventiveness. He must make the implements and toys which he cannot afford to buy or procure. He must run, adjust, and repair all sorts of machinery and farm utensils. His ingenuity and inventiveness are constantly exercised. If the wagon or plow breaks down, it must be repaired on the spot, often without the proper tools. This training develops instinctive courage, strong success qualities, and makes him a resourceful man. Is it any wonder that the boy so trained in self-reliance, so superbly equipped with physical and mental stamina, should take such preeminence, should be in such demand when he comes to the city? Is it any wonder that he is always in evidence in great emergencies and crises? Just stand a stamina-filled, self-reliant country boy beside a pale, soft, stamina-less, washed-out city youth. Is it any wonder that the country-bred boy is nearly always the leader, that he heads the banks, the great mercantile houses? Is it this peculiar, indescribable something, this superior stamina and mental caliber? I don't know how many times he's mentioned stamina now. This superior stamina and mental caliber that makes the stuff that rises to the top in all vocations. There is a peculiar quality of superiority which comes from dealing with realities that we do not find in the superficial city conditions. Again, he keeps referring to the city as superficial. The life-giving oxygen breathed in great inspirations through constant muscular effort develops in the country boy much greater lung power than is developed in the city youth, and his outdoor work tends to build up a robust constitution. Plowing, hoeing, mowing, everything he does on the farm gives him vigor and strength. His muscles are harder, his flesh firmer, and his brain fiber partakes of the same superior quality. He is constantly bottling up forces, storing up energy in his brain and muscles, which later may be powerful factors in shaping the nation's destiny, or which may furnish backbone to keep the ship of state from floundering upon the rocks. This marvelous reserve power which he stores up in the country will come out in the successful banker, statesman, lawyer, merchant, or businessman. Self-reliance and grit are oftenest country bred. The country boy is constantly thrown upon his own resources. He is forced to think for himself. and this calls out his ingenuity and makes him self-reliant and strong. It has been found that the use of tools in our manual training schools develops the brain, strengthens the deficient faculties, and brings out latent powers. The farm-reared boy is the best manual training school in the world. The farm-reared boy is in the best manual training school in the world and is constantly forced to plan things, make things. He is always using tools. This is one of the reasons why he usually develops better all-round judgment and a more level head than the city boy. It is human nature to exaggerate the value of things beyond our reach. People save money for years in order to go to Europe to visit the great art centers and see the famous masterpieces, when they have never really seen the marvelous pictures painted by the divine artist and spread in the landscape, in the sunset, in the glory of flowers and plant life, right at their very doors. What a perpetual inspiration, what marvels of beauty, what miracles of coloring are spread everywhere in nature, confronting us on every hand. We see them almost every day of our lives, and they become so common that they make no impression upon us. Think of the difference between what a Ruskin sees in a landscape and the impression conveyed to his brain, and what is seen by the ordinary mind, the ordinary person who has little or no imagination, and whose aesthetic faculties have scarcely been developed! Exclamation mark. We are immersed in a wilderness of mysteries and marvelous beauties. Miracles innumerable in grass and flower and fruit are performed right before our eyes. How marvelous is nature's growing of fruit, for example. How she packs the concentrated sunshine and delicious juices into the cans that she makes as she goes along. Cans exactly the right size, without a particle of waste, leakage, or evaporation, with no noise of factories, no hammering of tins. The miracles are wrought in a silent laboratory. Not a sound is heard, and yet what marvels of skill, deliciousness, and beauty. What interrogation points, what wonderful mysteries, what wit sharpeners are ever before the farmer boy, whichever way he turns. He's using a lot of exclamation marks here. Where does all this tremendous increase of corn, wheat, fruit, and vegetables come from? There seems to be no loss to the soil, and yet what a marvelous growth in everything. Life, life, more life on every hand. Wherever he goes, he treads on chemical forces which produce greater marvels than are described in the Arabian Nights. The trees, the brooks, the mountains, the hills, the valleys, the sunsets, the growing animals on the farm, all are mysteries that set him thinking and to wondering at the creative processes which are working on every hand. Then again, the delicious freedom of it all, as contrasted with the cramped artificial life in the city. Everything in the country tends to set the boy thinking to call out his dormant powers and develop his latent forces. And what health there is in it all! How hearty and natural he is in comparison with the city boy, who is tempted to turn night into day, to live an artificial, purposeless life. The very temptation in the city to turn night into day is of itself health undermining, stamina dissipating, and character weakening. While the city youth is wasting his precious energy capital in late hours, pleasure-seeking, and often dissipation, the country youth is storing up power and vitality. He is being recharged with physical force by natural, refreshing sleep, away from the distracting influence and enervating excitement of city life. The country youth does not learn to judge people by the false standards of wealth and social standing. He is not inculcated with snobbish ideas. Everything in the great farm kindergarten teaches him sincerity, simplicity, and honesty. The time was when the boy who gave no signs of genius or unusual ability was consigned to the farm, and the brilliant boy was sent to college or to the city to make a career for himself. But we are now beginning to see that man has made a botch of farming only because he looked upon it as a sort of humdrum occupation, as a means provided by nature for getting for those who were not good for much else. Farming was considered by many people as a sort of degrading occupation, desirable only for those who lacked the brains and education to go into a profession or some of the more refined callings. but the searchlight of science has revealed in it possibilities hitherto undreamed of. We are commencing to realize that it takes a high order of ability and education to bring out the fullest possibilities of the soil, and that it requires fine-grained sympathetic talent. We are now finding that agriculture is as great a science as astronomy, and that ignorant men have been getting an indifferent living from their farms simply because they did not know how to mix brains with the soil. The science of agriculture is fast becoming appreciated and is more and more regarded as a high and noble calling, a dignified profession. Think of what it means to go into partnership with the Creator in bringing out larger, grander products from the soil, to be able to cooperate with that divine creative force, and even to vary the size, the beauty, the perfume of flowers, to enlarge, modify, and change the flavor of fruits and vegetables to our liking. Think what it must mean to be a magician in the whole vegetable kingdom, like Luther Burbank, changing colors, flavors, perfumes, species. Almost anything is possible when one knows enough and has heart and sympathy enough to enter into partnership with the great creative force in nature. Mr. Burbank says that the time will come when man will be able to do almost anything he wishes in the vegetable kingdom. We will be able to produce at will any shade or color that man wishes, and almost any flavor in any fruit, that the size of all fruits and vegetables and flowers is just a matter of sufficient understanding, and that nature will give us almost anything when we know enough to treat her intelligently, wisely, and sympathetically. The history of most great men shows that there is a disadvantage in having too many advantages. That's a very interesting sentence right there. The history of most great men shows that there is a disadvantage in having too many advantages. Who can tell what the consequences would have been had Lincoln been born in New York and educated at Harvard? If he had been reared in the midst of great libraries, brought up in an atmosphere of books, of only a small fraction of which he could get even a superficial knowledge, would he have had that insatiable hunger which prompted him to walk 20 miles in order to borrow Blackstone's commentaries and to read 100 pages on the way home? What was there in that rude frontier forest, where this poor boy scarcely ever saw anyone who knew anything of books, to rouse his ambition and to stimulate him to self-education? Whence came that yearning to know the history of men and women who had made a nation, to know the history of his country? Whence came the passion to devour the dry statutes of Indiana, as a young girl would devour a love story? Whence came that all-absorbing ambition to be somebody in the world, to serve his country with no selfish ambition? Had his father been rich and well-educated instead of a poor man who could neither read nor write, and who was generally of a shiftless and roving disposition, there is no likelihood that Lincoln would ever have become the powerful man he was. Had he not felt that imperious must calling him, the prod of necessity spurring him on, whence would have come the motive which would have led him to struggle for self-development, self-unfoldment? If he had been born and educated in luxury, his character would probably have been soft and flabby in comparison with what it was. Where in all the annals of history is there another record of one born of such poor parentage and reared in such a wretched environment, who ever rose to such eminence? Imagine a boy of today so hungry for an education that he would walk 9 miles to attend a rude frontier school in a log cabin. What would the city boys of today, who do not want to walk even a few blocks to school, think of a youth who would do what Lincoln did to overcome his handicap? That's it. And they have a picture here of the house in which Abraham Lincoln was born. So that was The Country Boy by Orison Swett Marden, published in a book called Pushing to the Front, put out in 1911. So what do you think? Well, I think there are definitely some interesting thoughts there. I think that he makes a lot of interesting points, that he may be a bit bombastic and maybe overstating the case a bit, especially for 1911, my goodness. But I definitely think there's some good food for thought there. I definitely think that, there's a lot to be said. First of all, about just urban life. I've really become cognizant of this in recent years, just how, in a sense, depressing a lot of urban life can be. Now, it's true, some urban life can be very exciting. If you're in Midtown Manhattan and, the skyscrapers and all the business going on there and the tourists and so on and so forth and seeing the sights and whatnot. But, I live in Los Angeles, and one thing that, especially in recent years, has really become apparent to me is just how many areas of LA are just very, very kind of junky urban. That's how I would describe it. They're not necessarily bad areas. They're just kind of junky. And I notice this now. I mean, there's all kinds of areas of LA that I don't visit, I don't go to, I don't spend time in, because I feel like there's nothing there for me. I don't have any reason to go there. But say if I'm on my way to the airport, there's all kinds of little neighborhoods and whatnot that, if I'm taking a Lyft or an Uber to the airport, that you drive through. And I just kind of marvel sometimes. I see all these businesses, on the side, sides of the streets. And I certainly don't go to any of these places. A lot of nail salons, a lot of cell phone stores, a lot of convenience stores, and of course, endless fast food restaurants. And again, kind of the whole atmosphere and the whole world is just kind of very trashy and junky. And it's not very inspiring. There can be a lot of exciting things going on. But again, an awful lot of urban areas are really kind of very just junky. And I do think it gets to you after a while. I do think that it can have a negative impact on just kind of your whole outlook. It's not very inspiring. It's not a very inspiring place to live. It's not an inspiring place, I would imagine, to grow up. It's not an inspiring place to raise children. I feel in many ways very fortunate. I didn't grow up in the country, but I grew up in, I think, a very nice area in Pittsburgh. And we had a lot of nature around us. I mean, in a lot of ways, although we were very much in the city, the area where we were was surrounded by woods. And so I and my friends, we spent a lot of time when we were kids playing in the woods. And I've always had an appreciation for nature. And I've just never related at all to that super kind of urban life. Even now, where my mom lives in Pittsburgh, my mom has moved to another area, and she has a nice place, but the exact area where she lives, in my opinion, it's not a bad area. But I've said to her, this area right here where you're living, for me personally, it's too urban. It's just too. There's too much concrete. It's too artificial. It's too manufactured. Now there's some very, very nice areas of Pittsburgh. In fact, not too far from there's some huge wooded areas, which are part of Shenley Park, and there's also Frick Park. These are huge, huge acres of area with trails and whatnot. But again, a lot of just about any city now, you're going to have a lot of kind of this. You see the same store, all these kind of chain stores. You see the same place, kind of just over and over and over again. And I personally don't find it very inspiring. I know I keep saying that, but I think we have to be concerned about our environment. Now, I don't agree. I can't remember exactly what he said there about being a product of our environment. I don't think we are products of our environment per se. What does he say here? He says we are largely copies of our environment. I don't like that idea, that we're products of our environment or we're copies of our environment. But I do think our environment has a lot to do with just how we experience things. I mean, in the obvious sense, it's going to affect just what's available to us. and especially again to young kids growing up. What is available to them? What do they see around them? They can't create everything that they need. They have to be provided with stuff to think about and ponder and whatnot. And if everything around them is nail salons and 7-Elevens and cell phone stores and medical marijuana dispensaries and whatnot, I mean, you can imagine you're not really giving children a whole lot to feed off of, in their development. So anyway, I think he makes a lot of good points. The thing that I just keep going back to is this was published in a book that came out in 1911. And, when he's saying there, for example, now one thing I thought was really interesting was he was talking about the city boy. He has access to all these libraries. And that's why I said, this was obviously way, 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 way before. Hell, this was before radio. This was before radio. Never mind television, never mind internet, never mind smartphones. But he talks about the city boy. He has access to libraries. He has access to all of these materials, all of these periodicals and books and so on and so forth. And as a result of having tremendous access to all this stuff, he reads a lot, but he reads superficially. He glances at this newspaper and skims this article, and boy, I'll tell you, that hit home for me. If you think about that in terms of, again, what we have access to today. And one thing that I have always tried to practice with books, and this is something, for myself. I mean, I'm just completely inundated with books here, and I love them. But I do understand that idea of, like, you feel like you have so many books that any one particular book, oftentimes it doesn't seem very important because it seems like it's just one of a huge number of books. And what I like to do is select a book and then, in effect, almost forget about all your other books and imagine almost that this was the only book that you have. Like, just commit to reading this book. Now, if it's a truly terrible book, of course you can give up after a while and toss it aside. But to really almost imagine, like, what if this was the one and only book that I had? I'm going to really read this book, and I'm going to make sure that I understand it. I'm really going to take time to make sure that I understand this book. I've never understood speed reading. I know a lot of people, they read books very, very quickly. I know people who just go through huge numbers of books. I don't understand how you read a book in a couple hours. It just seems like it's almost like watching a movie on fast forward or something. I mean, you would probably get a gist of what it is, but there's an old Woody Allen joke. He said, I took a speed reading course and I read War and Peace in 13 minutes. It's about Russia. And that's about the long and short of it, I think. I think you really do have to spend time with a book. In fact, what I almost do, I don't do this with every book, but when I finish a book, like oftentimes the first thing I want to do when I'm done with it, assuming that it really was a good book and I felt I learned something from it, is I want to go back to the beginning. It's almost like sometimes, you'll watch a movie and there's stuff that is explained only like when you finally finish the movie, like certain scenes earlier kind of take on new meaning, and you almost want to go back and now rewatch the earlier parts of the movie with the knowledge that you have now at the end. I kind of want to do that with a lot of books too. So, but I definitely agree with him on that it's a two-edged sword is what it is. It would have been nice if he could have balanced it out a little bit more. I mean, he was just so, pro-country and anti-city. And the thing about it is, I guarantee you probably some people are going to watch this who grew up on farms. Even in modern times, they're going to say, what the hell is he talking about? I couldn't wait to get off the farm and get out to the city. City life is so much better. But again, I'm always looking at these things from partly from a historical standpoint, but then also just looking for a good food for thought. And you don't have to agree with everything, but I do think there were certain statements in there that are interesting. And like I said, you're not going to hear this too much from anywhere else. I just want to see, what was that one sentence I quoted that I really liked? I can't even remember what it is now. Oh, yeah, that there's a disadvantage in having too many advantages. That's a very interesting statement, something to think about. Anyway, well, that's what I think. If you have any comments, if you want to share your thoughts, you can get all of these essays. Again, the book is called Pushing to the Front by Orison, Orison, Swett, Swett, Marden, Marden. You can look it up online, and I don't know, I guess you can read it on your computer. I actually found the essays initially online, but I wanted to seek out an actual 1911 copy of this book. So that's the real way to read it. So that's what I think. And if you have any other thoughts or comments, feel free to share them. I'll talk to you later.